the Federal Spending Oversight Subcommittee to order. The topic today is going to be government waste and how we can practically do something to curb waste, but also to ameliorate the problem we have with a growing deficit. We have a deficit this year that's expected to be about $583 billion, and some will say we're fixing the deficit because it's getting smaller. Yet the overall debt is growing enormously larger. We have about $1 million that we borrow every minute, and I think this is a threat to our economy, and some economists have said it's costing us millions of jobs, just the burden of this debt. So what we're going to do is talk about some of the waste, and some of this has been talked about in the past, but my hope is from the discussion today to actually itemize some of this. And as we itemize this, actually then give advice to some of the people who spend this, the committees that spend this. And too often we have reports and they just never get acted upon. The new majority has said we are going to try to pass all of the appropriation bills. There is a great deal of power to the purse if we'll actually use it. It's what the expression is supposed to mean, that we're supposed to express how we'd like the money to be spent. But if you don't have appropriation bills, you're lumped all together in some omnibus or continuing resolution, you lose your power as to direct how to spend it. And as a consequence, we never eliminate any of the waste. I've seen very little example that we eliminate any waste that we determine. But it's my hope to not just have a discussion of this today, but to have as a conclusion to actually have a blueprint for how we could get rid of government waste. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our ranking member, Senator Baldwin.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Chairman Paul. It's great to join you for our inaugural subcommittee hearing. And I very much look forward to working with you on this issue and others under our subcommittee's jurisdiction as we move forward. I actually want to take a few moments to outline a couple of issues for today's hearing as well as moving forward. And we'll go on, if you'll indulge me, for a few minutes here because this is our inaugural meeting and I'm very excited to kick things off. First of all, in my home state of Wisconsin, people are working harder than ever and taking home less, and hardworking families and businesses in Wisconsin are struggling to get ahead. I know that's the case many places in the United States. And Congress has a choice to recognize this and work together to create a stronger economy and growth and security for our people. Now, I'm a Wisconsin progressive, and I know well the legacy of Senator Bill Proxmire. He took on wasteful government spending, and I know that he didn't take on this fight and pass out golden fleece awards because he was opposed to government. He did it because our progressive values hold to the belief that every dollar of waste was a dollar that wasn't being invested in growing hardworking middle class in the United States. And as I've traveled the state of Wisconsin, people have asked nothing more than a fair shot at getting ahead. They expect us to cut wasteful government spending and tax expenditures that favor those at the top. They also expect smart investments that grow the economy and create shared prosperity. In short, they want us to reduce spending without shortchanging their future. In Wisconsin, we have a work ethic that is second to none. We pinch our pennies, and we expect, and our people expect us to do the same with taxpayer dollars. And in my view, that's what today's hearing is all about. Now, I want to just mention a couple of things that I know we're going to focus on today, and I trust we will continue to focus on in the future. First of all, the GAO reports every 2 years on areas within the federal government that are vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement. Since the 1990s, the GAO has identified more than 50 areas that are at high risk. However, steady progress has been made in these areas, and 23 areas have been removed from the list altogether. For example, The Food and Drug Administration has significantly improved its oversight of medical device recalls. The Defense Department has shown some strides and is making progress in the management and oversight of its contracting approaches. And NASA has significantly strengthened its acquisition management functions. Yet in spite of this progress, many, many challenges remain. Earlier this year, the GAO added two new areas to its high-risk list, including VA Health Administration. The GAO determined that VA facilities have failed to provide timely health care and in some cases have harmed veterans, and we need to do better for our nation's veterans. Another area that I know we'll discuss today with this expert panel that is ripe for congressional review is improper payments. In fiscal year 2014, government-wide improper payments reached approximately $248 billion, and that's an increase of $19 billion from the prior fiscal year. GAO has found that agencies continue to struggle with reducing the number of improper payments and lack the internal controls to determine the full extent of the improper payments. This is an area that I think we can all agree that more work needs to be done. I want to move on from areas where the GAO believes that we can achieve savings and onto an area that I personally feel passionately about and want to further explore. A critical part of improving economic security is guaranteeing that everyone has access to high quality and affordable health care. And the Affordable Care Act has already made a strong investment in the health security of our middle class and families across this country. More than 10 million Americans have signed up for affordable health insurance provided by the new law. In Wisconsin, it's over 180,000 who have quality health plans, and 90% of them are benefiting from premium tax credits to help pay for this coverage. The law is also strengthening our investments in Medicare and reducing costs for our nation's seniors. About 9.4 million seniors in Medicare have each saved an average of $1,598 on prescription drugs in the donut hole. I'm committed to making sure that America's new health law works for Wisconsin and across the country, and for fixing what doesn't work. And that means putting partisanship aside to implement the law and finding common sense areas in which to improve the law. To that end, I believe that there are significant savings that can be achieved within our health care system without compromising quality of care or slashing benefits that seniors have earned. There are a number of nonpartisan and bipartisan think tanks and other groups that have issued recommendations to Congress about delivery system reform in the health care arena, some arguing that we could realize up to $1 trillion of savings without affecting health care outcomes by enacting smart and targeted health care delivery reforms. These are truly impressive savings that would strengthen our nation's health care system without shifting costs to seniors or to states. Chairman Paul, I would hope that as we begin a dialogue about finding solutions to federal spending waste, fraud, and abuse, that we can also begin this dialogue about how to produce health care cost savings. I'm confident that if both parties in Washington do what the people do every day in the state of Wisconsin and in all of our states, which is putting progress ahead of politics, that we can root out wasteful spending and improve the delivery of our nation's priorities for all Americans. So again, thank you, Chairman Paul, for providing us the opportunity to discuss these important issues, and for our witnesses in being here today to take part in this discussion. And my hope is that when we leave here today, we will have areas in which we can address so that we can deliver our nation's priorities in the most efficient and effective way possible.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. With that, I think we'll start with Ms. Romina Bacha. Ms. Bacha has a master's degree in economics from George Mason University and is currently a Grover M. Herman Research Fellow and Federal Budgetary Affairs and Research Manager for the Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity at the Heritage Foundation. Boy, that's a mouthful. Her work there focuses on a variety of spending and budgetary process issues. Delving into the federal budget, she's keenly aware of government spending and in particular government waste. We look forward to hearing your insights.
I thank Chairman Paul and Ranking Member Baldwin for inviting me today to present my views on wasteful spending in the federal government. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. A Gallup poll last year reported that Americans believe that the federal government wastes 51 cents of every dollar that they pay in taxes. Another Gallup poll in the same year reported that trust in the Congress is at an all-time low, with only 28% of Americans reporting that they had a great deal or even just a fair amount of trust in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Certainly, these dismal polling results do not necessarily reflect how much or how little waste there actually is in government, nor how trustworthy lawmakers are, but I do think they show a disturbing trend. As trust in government has declined, Americans' perception of government waste has increased at the same time that federal spending has grown. High perceptions of government waste and low levels of trust are, I believe, in part a result that Americans recognize that the federal government is doing too many things that would be better done by individuals in the private sector or businesses, or by state and local governments, or that should not be done at all. Moreover, recent bank and auto industry bailouts and massive government handouts to well-connected businesses as part of the so-called stimulus conveyed to Americans in no uncertain terms that cronyism and corporate welfare are rampant in Washington. Americans increasingly believe that the system is rigged against them. Corporate welfare and crony capitalism are reflected in backroom deals in which a small group of individuals is able to influence legislation or regulation to the benefit of a narrow interest at the expense of the public. They are also reflected in the establishment and continuation of government programs that purport to serve broader, noble goals, but that mostly divert resources away from the wants and needs of consumers and towards political purposes. The most comprehensive, lasting, and sustainable solution to address corporate welfare and cronyism in Washington is to return to limited government. To reduce the size of government, we must limit the scope of government. As part of my written record today, I'm presenting to the committee a list of 21 programs that I categorize as corporate welfare spending that wastes taxpayer and economic resources. Many of these very same programs have also been recommended for elimination by other organizations and for many years. Each program on this list takes taxpayer money and gives it to a business or uses it to promote business activities, either for the purpose of supporting the business directly or to achieve some other goal that also lies outside the proper scope of the federal government. Moreover, several programs on my list are duplicative of other federal, state, and private efforts, and several have come under scrutiny due to waste and abuse. Congress should eliminate these programs. They include the Export-Import Bank, which presents an immediate opportunity for the Congress to do nothing and allow the bank to expire for once and for all. They also include the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is the government agency that promotes investment in developing countries by, for example, financing Papa John's pizza franchises in Russia and a Ritz-Carlton in Turkey. Moreover, it includes costly FCC Universal Service Fund programs that have long outlived their purpose and that today nickel and dime Americans on their telephone bills to provide overpriced telephone lines to, for example, resort towns in Colorado. Every dollar spent by the federal government for the benefit of a well-connected interest group is a dollar that is no longer available to American families and businesses to spend and invest to meet their own needs and desires. Corporate welfare spending is particularly morally reprehensible when government spends resources that belong to the next generation. With deficits of $500 billion and growing, cutting corporate welfare and waste is long overdue. The Defense Department's Base Closure and Realignment Commission, or BRAC, provides a valuable mechanism for eliminating wasteful and unnecessary government spending. I believe that the idea that an independent commission guided by clear criteria can overcome special interest politics and congressional gridlock in pursuit of the national interest, I think it deserves serious consideration. Thank you.
I think rather than go on to the next, I want to just do it a little bit differently. We get so much information by going through 5. There's only 2 of us to ask questions, so we're going to ask a few questions, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
On the Ex-Im Bank, you know, some people maintain, well, it makes a profit for the government. And now we'll start with Ms. Baccia, but we'll let the panel answer. 1, that it makes money, and 2, that everybody else does it, so why shouldn't we do it? Ms. Baccia, would you care to respond?
With the Export-Import Bank, what many miss is that there are huge taxpayer liabilities that may not come due tomorrow or next year. But in an economic downturn like the one we recently experienced, it is possible that taxpayers could face large liabilities from the loan guarantees that the bank makes. Moreover, the bank only benefits a very narrow group of special interests, in particular Boeing. And just because other countries are doing the wrong thing doesn't mean the United States should be doing the same thing. I think we should be leading as a country with the right policies.
Anybody else want to comment to that question?
I'll give you an opinion on Ex-Im that is not based on data, but I believe it's the most important thing with corporate welfare, and that is I believe corporate welfare makes U.S. businesses weaker. I can't prove that, but I've read about many programs over the years and looked at how these companies, they spend their time in Washington lobbying rather than concentrating on making better products, which is what they should be doing. I think Solyndra was a great example of that. They were so focused on getting the government subsidies in Washington, they didn't realize that China was creating inventions and innovations that went around them, and ultimately they went bankrupt because of that. So just like conservatives often complain that welfare programs have harmful effects on the individuals who receive them by sapping their sort of interest and incentive to work, it's the same with business subsidies. Business subsidies weaken American business, I think.
And I think one response to that also would be that one thing that Americans seem to hate about government is they think there's too much money involved in their government, that money buys influence. The Solyndra loan was from a very big campaign donor to one party. The corporation that gets a lot of money from Ex-Im is very active here in town, and the question is, if you're really for campaign finance reform, maybe we ought to start with not giving out specific items that seem to go to specific corporate entities.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to add, we're certainly also opposed to Ex-Im, but also on the other side of the ledger, that some of the companies that are benefiting in other countries are actually state-owned companies or are also extremely well off, like Pemex in Mexico. And there's been good analysis done by the Mercator Center over at George Mason University that has a lot of that there.
I don't want to take a little bit more time on that, but I agree with everything everybody said, and I think it's something, again, Congress has to start somewhere, and in this case, it's easy, just don't reauthorize it.
I take a different view on the Export-Import Bank, and I guess I'd ask a couple of questions. A lot of the small firms in Wisconsin, and I would say largely it's smaller firms, sometimes who are exporting directly, sometimes who are supplying to the larger Boeings, for example. If you think about their business plan, they're working with a lot of smaller businesses that are supplying parts. They're really assemblers more in some ways than actually producing the raw materials that go into their final products, their planes, et cetera. A lot of the small businesses have not been able to find the type of support they need for starting to export their products from community banks, from the banking institutions. But not only that, the insurance products that are peculiar and unique to the Export-Import Bank. And I wonder why you feel certain that products that are not currently being offered are all of a sudden going to materialize across the United States to help our small businesses be able to compete in those export markets.
Oh, there are lots of other companies and businesses that export products that may not be related to a particular industry. And I think the point where I hope, again, not speaking for everybody, but I think we all agree that it's so focused on Boeing and a few other companies that it does distort other opportunities to export products that may be available through other sources. And clearly, Boeing itself is capable of finding all kinds of money in the commercial sector, commercial banks, to export their products and in turn help these other companies who may be making parts.
If the Export-Import Bank is in fact making a profit, and I would argue it is not, especially not in the long run, then this would be the greatest sign for a private sector bank to step in and take over those functions if Congress allowed the bank to expire.
Senator, one thing that I want to emphasize is your point about the extended production chain, that there are 2 points here that are worth making. The first is that Boeing is obviously a large company and it clearly has access to capital, but it, as you pointed out, is often much more an assembler of products that are produced across the entire country as opposed to just being produced in Seattle, Washington. And the second point that's important is that while Boeing has ready access to capital, that may not always be the case for other companies down the production chain. And the cost of the product that Boeing makes is the product of the assemblage of all the pieces that go along the way. And the ability of Boeing to be able to produce a quality product at a reasonable price depends on the ability of each of those individual elements of the chain to be able to obtain their own financing. And they're often in a very different situation than is the case with Boeing. So it's a complicated situation to be sure, but it would be a mistake, I think, to look at the Export-Import Bank solely in terms of the ability of Boeing as a company to be able to obtain financing, to be able to export, because, in fact, it's a much more complicated piece.
And I would, just to, if you have any further comment on this, I think about the Wisconsin economy and the small businesses and medium-sized businesses that I visit that actually use the Export-Import Bank services as well as sometimes financing, selling farm implement into countries in Eastern Europe, for example, where there's significantly different norms and customs in the financial system. And if you don't actually have a local bank that has some knowledge of those customs and rules and some conversancy in that, it's really difficult. And yet there's these relationships between small communities in Wisconsin and markets abroad that are very important to our economy. And I don't think there would be other solutions for them without the bank. And I don't know, again, where you think that expertise would be developed across the country to help our small businesses make headway in those markets.
I mean, it does strike me, Senator, that, I mean, if Congress, what you're talking about is extremely important. I want American businesses to be the most competitive in the world, and we should be. But Congress does a lot of stuff that makes American businesses less competitive. Regulatory stuff, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. You know, I would think it would be fantastic after export-import expired that Congress looked at some of these competitiveness issues with U.S. businesses. I mean, financial services is massively regulated today. That hasn't done anything good to provide a flow of capital to small and large businesses. Again, the tax code's a horrible mess. So, you know, I guess I would, you know, try to look at positive things Congress can do to sort of get out of the way of American exporters.
Good, that's where we're going now. Back to Mr. Edwards. Our next witness is Chris Edwards, who's the Director of Tax Policy Studies at Cato, editor of DownsizingGovernment.org, and author of a book by the same name. Prior to joining Cato, he served as a senior economist on the Joint Economic Committee and a manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers and an economist with the Tax Foundation. Needless to say, Mr. Edwards has extensively looked at what is not working in our government, and his testimony today should be very informative. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, and Ranking Member Baldwin. Thanks for inviting me to testify. The government is still running huge deficits, so cutting wasteful spending should be a high priority. Wasteful spending includes not just the sort of mismanagement like improper payments we're all used to. I think more broadly, waste includes spending that is low value and would be more efficiently handled by state governments. Wasteful spending has plagued the federal government since the very beginning. As just one example, even back in the 19th century, the Army Corps of Engineers was known for cost overruns and pork barrel spending. The government is far larger today, and so the waste has multiplied. There are basic structural reasons for federal waste. Unlike businesses, federal agencies, of course, don't have to earn profits, so they have little incentive to restrain costs and improve quality. Unlike businesses, failed federal programs don't go bankrupt. 10% of all U.S. companies go out of business each year. Failure gets punished in the private sector pretty severely, but failed federal programs unfortunately last for decades often. Federal workers almost never get fired. The firing rate in the private sector in the United States is 6 times higher than the firing rate in the federal government. The firing rate for corporate CEOs is 20 times higher than the firing rate for the senior executive service, who are the senior career people in the federal government. Bureaucratic layering is a problem. Research has found that corporate America has become a lot leaner in recent decades with fewer layers of management. The federal government has gone in the reverse direction. Research by Paul Light at Brookings has found that the number of layers of management in the federal government has increased substantially in recent years. And he argues that those excessive management layers in the federal government have been a main cause of a number of the recent failures and scandals. The vast size of the federal government makes it impossible to oversee. There are 2,300 federal subsidy programs. All of them are susceptible to waste, fraud, and abuse. And here's a remarkable statistic I came across recently. The federal budget of $4 trillion a year is 100 times the average state government budget in the United States. So the Virginia state budget is $40 billion. The federal budget is 100 times greater. So federal spending is far too large for auditors and oversight committees to properly monitor. The best solution to the waste problem is to cut the federal government size, and I think a prime target for cuts ought to be federal aid to state and local government, which costs over $600 billion a year. Aid to states is particularly susceptible to waste for reasons I go to in my written testimony. I'm just going to mention a few aid to state programs that I think Congress ought to cut. Urban transit, $13 billion a year. Federal aid encourages cities to buy expensive light rail systems rather than more efficient bus systems. Without federal aid, cities would make more efficient investment choices, and they would have a much more incentive to control costs. Disaster aid. FEMA provides billions a year in preparedness grants and disaster aid to states. In the last couple decades, the federal government has intervened in many more localized disaster events that ought to be handled instead by state and local governments. I think this is a big mistake. Federal intervention, in my view, will ultimately weaken America's ability to respond to natural disasters. I think FEMA ought to be cut, and I think we would have a stronger response system to natural disasters because of it. The Economic Development Agency in the Department of Commerce, $450 million a year. That was actually one of Senator Proxmire's, it won many Golden Fleece Awards from Senator Proxmire decades ago. And the problems are the same today, actually. The EDA sends out money to local governments and businesses. The money used to go to high poverty areas. Now it's sprinkled across the country, often to high income areas. There's no reason for the EDA to exist. I looked on the EDA's website yesterday, and just yesterday they handed out a $1.2 million loan, or sorry, not a loan, a grant to a poultry company in Arkansas to build an access road from its facility to the highway. Now that sounds like a useful project, but why should the federal government be involved? I think local projects ought to be handled and funded locally. I think federal involvement in such local projects just creates bureaucracy. So I think the EDA ought to be ended. The school lunch and breakfast program, $16 billion a year. Because the funding comes from Washington, local school administrators have very little incentive to reduce waste and abuse. The improper payment rate in the school lunch program is 16%. The improper payment rate for the breakfast program is 25%. Those are enormous improper and fraud rates in those programs. The reason is local governments have an incentive to maximize the number of students on those programs to draw more funds from their state and the federal government. If local governments had to rely on their own funding, they would have stronger incentives to reduce waste. So in sum, I think a great place to start cutting spending would be the $600 billion a year we spend on aid to state and local governments. The cuts I mentioned today and many others are proposed on Cato's website, downsizinggovernment.org. And thank you very much for holding these hearings. I think it's a very important subject.
Well, thank you for your testimony. I think one of the interesting things about it is if we want to define how ineffectual government is that Senator Proxmire talked about something, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and we still haven't gotten rid of it. We've gotten great reports. Senator Coburn was good at getting reports from GAO on waste and duplicative programs, and yet we still have them. I mean, I think that's why, the people are frustrated with us, is that we actually have the answers to a lot. May not balance a budget, but it make a government a lot less unwieldy and wasteful if we were to get rid of some of the things we all know about and yet can't seem to get bipartisan support for doing it. But I think you also pointed out a bigger problem that I think is important to point out. I'll often ask the question rhetorically when I speak with folks, and I'll say, well, it's not that government is inherently stupid, although that's a debatable question. It's that they don't get the right incentives. So government employees don't really, in a business you're trying to maximize things. It's the beauty of capitalism that people sort of take for granted. It's how would we do things without the Ex-Im Bank, without that knowledge? Well, that knowledge is out there in the capitalist world, and iTunes doesn't need it, iPads don't need it, good products don't need any help from government, they sell. And it's an amazingly intricate process figuring out where you get all the components, even for a pencil. Leonard Reed, wrote the little pamphlet iPencil many years ago, and just how complicated it is to make something as simple as a pencil, acquiring ingredients from different continents, putting them together and selling them for pennies. A pencil would cost, $1,000 if government made pencils, because they don't have the proper incentives to do anything efficiently. So therefore, we ought to minimize what government does, send it back closer to the people, to the state levels a little bit better, and then ultimately back to the people if we can. I think that when we look at this, you see this also in the firing rate that you mentioned. We can't even fire people in government who have committed malfeasance sometimes. The VA employees, we had to pass a law to fire them. I'm still not sure if we've actually fired anybody over the fake, the falsification of the waiting lines. We talk about how we get good people. The post office, I think, loses $1 billion a quarter, and I remember questioning that they wanted to pay them more, and the answer was, well, to keep good people, you need to pay them. And I said, well, how good do you have to be to lose $1 billion a quarter? But I think you're right. What we have to do, the problem is when we get to this, and this is the danger, and this is why people don't want to talk about the specifics of waste, because my goodness, you're talking about school lunches. And so people are like, no, not the children. We're not going to do this to the children. Well, the way I look at it, it's a little differently. With disability or with children, I look at that if you have a 20% improper payment rate, that you're stealing that from what we have, the limited resources we have to help people. So I'm not against the school lunch program, but I'm against giving my kids a free lunch. And everybody, I think all the kids at my kids' school can get it because we're beyond a certain amount. I think everybody can get the free lunch if they want to. And so, we do have to do these things. The earned income tax credit, there can be a place for that, but we've got there $20 billion worth of overpayment, false payments. Social Security, the report came out recently, $17 million going to dead people. You would think we could agree, bipartisan, not to pay dead people anymore. But it goes on year after year after year. Social Security thinks currently there are 6.5 million people over the age of 112. That's where their computer, resources are at this point. So yeah, we have to do more. And the question I have in general is, I guess, how do we finally do what we've identified for years and decades? How do we finally get it done? And how do we talk about emotional subjects like school lunches without being portrayed as the Grinch? Chris?
Romina talked about a BRAC commission, which worked very successfully, I guess 4 rounds or more with the Pentagon. Great program and great design of that. I'm not sure that would work for most of the rest of the budget. I think members of Congress have to believe in reducing spending for it to actually happen. You can have all the rules you want, and we can change the procedural rules. But ultimately, people have to believe that federal or that state and local governments can do these things better. I am in favor of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. If you've supported Senator Paul, I think that is a way that we can force discipline. 49 of the 50 states have legal, constitutional, or statutory requirements to balance their budget, and it works extremely well. Liberal states, conservative states, ultimately they have to take responsibility. They have to make tough decisions. You folks up here, with due respect, you don't make the tough decisions, and so I think that is one solution to the problem.
It forces you to prioritize. Because we have a printing press and we don't seem to care about the debt, people come up and everybody's got a program. Everybody's got something that tugs at the heart, and so we give them all money. And you're right, if there was an overall rule that you only spent what came in, then we would have to prioritize, and we would have to say, you know what, maybe healthy people shouldn't get disability, or maybe this person has a disability that's worse that needs it, but that we can't give everybody in the country disability. So anyway, thanks for your response, Senator Baldwin.
Yeah, because not everyone's testified, I'm trying to recall what each of you addressed in your written testimony, but I want to follow something that I believe you put in your written testimony and didn't necessarily elaborate on just now. In terms of observing that the metrics available in the private sector are somewhat different than the metrics available in the public sector to be able to measure outputs, to measure efficiency, effectiveness, et cetera. But where they are available, certainly we want to seize those and use that. And I think, Dr. Kettle, you had some similar observations just about the inherently different role of private enterprise and public enterprise. We had a hearing in the full committee yesterday, Homeland Security Committee, about TSA that's been under, you've been reading about some of the problems. One of the whistleblowers who was at the table testified that the metrics that they have on if there's undue delays in getting through a security line are very precise. They have to report to the airlines if somebody spent more than 5 minutes in a pre-check line and more than 20 minutes in a non-pre-check line. But the measurements and the metrics and the yardsticks for catching any dangerous item that might be in luggage are far less clear and far harder to pin down. So I guess what I'm getting around to is, can you envision better performance metrics for a number of the critically important enterprises that we oversee in the Congress, working as well, obviously, in government as it does in the private sector, and any improvements that you can see to, for example, the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act to reduce our inefficiencies? And I would direct that at both.
The government goals are very amorphous often, so it's difficult to pin down heads of agencies whether or not their agencies are succeeding or failing. An additional problem is that most government activities are monopolies. The TSA has an aviation security monopoly. It's hard to judge monopolies because there's nothing to compare it to. And so what I've written about with the TSA, for example, is to move to a system like they have in Canada and Europe, where the screening at airports is decentralized to the airports. In Canada, all the airports use private security. They have private security companies competing for the contracts. They give them contracts. They say you have to meet these levels of performance. If you fail, you're fired. In Europe, it's generally airports' responsibility. They can keep their own in-house security. They can use private security. So I think when you have a decentralized solution like that, we can, the government as the overseer of aviation security could compare airports, could publish metrics comparison. We could have the GAO do their undercover investigations at the airports. We could compare results. Companies are doing a good job. They could be fired.
Yeah, and maybe in follow-up to this hearing, I think what they're struggling with is what those metrics should be. And it's easy to say, did somebody pass through pre-check in 5 minutes, and did somebody check through the non-pre-check security screening within 20, and what factors led to that not happening. But the essence of TSA is making sure that we are safe in our travel, and it's great if that can happen expeditiously, but the safety is the bottom line, and those metrics are much harder, but if we have them, that's great. Dr. Kettle.
And Senator, that's an incredibly important point, and it's important to remember that regardless of whether the security function is being performed by a government agency or by a private company, the central goal is the same. Should, heaven forbid, a problem happen, it won't matter, in a sense, whether it was a private or a public security screener who was responsible for it. And it's worth remembering that the problems on 9/11 came through, for the most part, private security screeners there as well. So it's not privateness or publicness that really defines the problem of measuring government performance. It has to do with first trying to understand what it is that we want to try to accomplish, how we can explain to taxpayers what value that they're getting. Second, to recognize that we have made tremendous progress under both the current and the previous administration. Republicans and Democrats have been together in trying to improve government performance. The Bush administration deserves enormous credit for its efforts. The Obama administration has as well. And one of the most important things that Congress can do is to ensure that that progress continues to the next administration after that, to turn up the heat, to keep it on, to force at every occasion when members of the administration come to testify, regardless of party, to come and explain to taxpayers what value they're producing for the dollars that they're getting, and then use the measures and the metrics that have been developed to try to do that. And Senator Ayotte has been very active in the Moneyball movement, which is another way to try to provide better metrics. We've proven that this has been, can be, must be a bipartisan effort. And if it has to do with the public interest, we can debate separately who best can perform it. But we should not debate whether or not performance metrics have to be at the core about what it is that government does.
I see that Senator Ernst is here. You can either ask questions now if you want. We're kind of going one person at a time. If you're ready and have a question, go ahead. If not, we'll go to the next person, and then you can ask questions.
Certainly. Thank you, Chairman Paul. I appreciate that opportunity. This is an important hearing, so I am glad we are here today and able to visit with you. Thank you. I apologize for my tardiness. I do want to start off with just a brief comment that is fitting for today's hearing topic before I move into my question. Today I'm introducing the Program Management and Improvement Accountability Act with Senator Heitkamp. And the bill targets wasteful spending in government that is a direct result of poor program and project management in agencies. Shortcomings and failures in program management have plagued our federal government for decades. This is an ongoing issue. And we have read about these failures in the media. We've read about them through IG reports, through the GAO high-risk list. Many of you are intimately familiar with that. And poor program management leads to projects that are grossly over budget, delayed, or do not meet the intended goal of the project. And I've got just a few examples that we've compiled of that. One is the VA scheduling replacement project, which was terminated in September 2009 after spending an estimated $127 million in 9 years. So it was terminated. The Homeland Security new headquarters, the project is 11 years behind schedule. 11 years behind schedule, and more than $1.5 billion over budget. The project is the D.C. area's largest planned construction project since the Pentagon, and it was to be finished in 2014, but is still almost entirely undeveloped, though it has cost $4.5 billion so far. The new completion date is now 2026. Okay, great example. Great example. Department of Defense's Expeditionary Combat Support System, it was canceled in December 2012 after spending more than $1 billion and failing to deploy within 5 years of initially obligating the funds. These are just a few examples of where we've seen program management failures. And I really could go on and on. We have found so many examples of this through all different types of agencies. The federal government is literally wasting billions and billions of dollars because they are not working smartly on these projects. So, Mr. Kettle, thank you for being here today. But you mentioned managing boundaries and human capital as one of the root causes to the government's ongoing problems of wasteful spending. And these issues are really at the heart of why I'm focusing on this bill and trying to improve this situation. And can you elaborate on both of these issues a little bit more?
Senator, there's nobody alive who could possibly justify long delays, waste of money, and non-performance of governmental programs. Everybody agrees that's a bad idea. The question is what we do about it. And we can either decide we're just not going to do it, but if we decide it's something we must do, then the challenge is figuring out how. And as I'll talk a bit about more when I testify shortly, you look at the high-risk list, and on the one hand, it could be read as a string of horror stories. On the other hand, it can be seen as a set of opportunities to learn about what it is that the most difficult problems in government have in common. And if you look down over those issues, there are problems of contract management, of the fact that nothing that really matters any longer is any one problem that any one agency or any one sector can possibly control. And so we need to get managers who are better at building boundaries and make the coordination work better. But in the end, ultimately, this comes down to making sure we have the government's talent management problem under control, getting the right people with the right skills in the right places to be able to do the things that have to be done. And in a lot of ways, the issues of trying to manage the VA comes down to things like that. One of the government's biggest problems is acquisition management. It's having enough smart acquisition managers to do the things that we decide that government must do, and we have to find a way to close the acquisition talent gap that's there. Not long ago, I was at a meeting of some of what I was privileged to be among some of the smartest people in town talking about the issues confronting the next administration, regardless of party. And surprisingly, the one issue that came boiling out of everything was the issue of talent. That we can talk separately about how many government employees we want to have, but it is clear that we face a significant gap between the kind of workforce that we need with the right incentives and the kind of jobs that we expect government to do. And too often we separate out the question of government's function, which is something we need to debate, and the question of how best to try to fulfill it. And assuming that we can simply cut government employees and produce a better government, that's not always the case. One of the things that I discovered in preparation for the hearing today is I was curious about the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which have enormous amounts of problems of wasteful spending, enormous amounts of improper payments. On average, each employee who works for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is responsible for $144 million per employee. And we have to ask, how is it that we're likely to get better performance and reduce improper payments if we don't at least figure out what we need to make sure that the agency is managed well? We ought to, we need to, we must have a debate about the basic ideological principles and the basic goals for achieving government, but once we set those governmental goals, we have an obligation to taxpayers to make sure that we have the capacity to deliver. Mm-hmm. And if we do not, if we don't invest in that, there's no single waste that's bigger in government than that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kettle. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. I just wanted to mention, since Senator Ernst and Senator Ayotte are here, if you have specific ideas like the legislation you're doing, my goal at the end of this hearing is to collect them. We may not all agree on them, but if 8 or 10 of us agree on some reforms, we sign it, send it to the subcommittee on appropriations and say, these are changes that we can do. If it's legislation we can push out of here, yes. But let's try to have, when we finish this, we'll ask the experts, we'll try to have some specific ideas on how we could actually save money and send it in a written form to the appropriation committees. And I'm going to change the rules one more time. This is my first time to be in charge, so I get to change the rules all the time. I think we need to get through the testimony. So let's go through Mr. Ellis, Mr. Schatz, and Mr. Kettle, and then Senator Ayotte will go. Is that okay with you? All right. Mr. Steve Ellis, I'm going to give an introduction here as the Vice President of Taxpayers for Common Sense, where he's been for nearly 2 decades now. Over this time, Mr. Ellis has written and spoken on a wide array of topics related to government spending. He's a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy and served there with distinction, and this committee welcomes Mr. Steve Ellis.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Baldwin, Senator Ernst, Senator Ayotte. Thank you for inviting me to testify here today about government spending, waste, and what can be done about it. I am Steve Ellis, Vice President of Taxpayers for Common Sense, a national nonpartisan budget watchdog. And Senator Proxmire has come up a few times. I just wanted to note that the late senator was our honorary advisory board chair, and he bequeathed the Golden Fleece to us in 2000. And in fact, we gave Golden Fleece just last week to the House and Senate Appropriations Committees for continuing a program that ships Pennsylvania coal to Germany to power some of our U.S. bases there. So I was asked to address non-defense discretionary spending outside of agriculture. My written testimony includes wasteful policy that leads to failed resource management and future taxpayer liabilities. I want to assure each and every one of you that Taxpayers for Common Sense is willing, ready, and able to work with you to eliminate waste and inefficiency in all areas of government, including defense and tax expenditures, to give taxpayers a government that works. I brought our common sense cuts for the 114th Congress, silencing sequester scaremongers with $2 trillion in deficit reduction that I would like to enter into the record. There are a variety of spending programs that are either wasteful, corporate welfare, or simply not a federal responsibility. Here are a few highlights. There are many subsidy programs at the Department of Energy for sources new and old. Spending, tax credits, and mandates such as the Renewable Fuel Standard create a crazy quilt of government support that often works at cross purposes. It would be better to simply eliminate all energy subsidies and start with a blank slate. Then policymakers could determine what basic research the U.S. should support. For example, just 3 of the energy subsidy programs, fossil energy research and development, mixed oxide, fissile materials dispositions, and fusion energy sciences received more than $1.3 billion in fiscal year 2015. All told, the energy subsidy programs from renewables to nuclear to fossils received many billions more. A subset of energy, more than $200 million in bioenergy subsidies, are scattered throughout the Departments of Agriculture, Energy, Treasury, and EPA. From research and development to harvesting and storing them, taxpayers subsidize every step of the biofuels biomass process. We even pay to convert heat and power sources at biofuels facilities to run on biomass, then subsidize production and retail. Over the last decade, Congress has transferred more than $50 billion from the Treasury to backfill the Highway Trust Fund. CBO estimates the gas tax shortfall could require as much as $167 billion over the next 10 years at the current rate of spending. Leaving aside debates about revenue sources, the spending beyond the trust fund's means must stop. Furthermore, there is a bias for new construction over maintenance. This preference for funding ribbon cutting over repairs will add additional pressure on the bankrupt federal funding system. The Essential Air Service is a relic of the 1970s in airline deregulation. EAS subsidizes air carriers to maintain flights between rural communities and regional hub airports. These trips cost taxpayers as much as $1,000 per flight, and often the small planes that service the routes run nearly empty. TCS has uncovered numerous examples of communities that could link to nearby hubs with intercity bus service that could be run with little or no subsidy at all. Annually, this program costs taxpayers roughly $250 million. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works program suffers from a lack of prioritization, which inevitably leads to waste as lower priority projects are funded over more critical ones. There's also the duplicative and wasteful environmental infrastructure program and beach replenishment subsidies. The inland waterway industry contributes nothing to maintain the inland waterways. They should pay at least 50%, and low-use or no-use waterways should be removed from the federal system. The Inland Waterway Users Board can be eliminated entirely. These reforms would save more than $500 million annually. Eliminating wasteful projects and taming the more than $60 billion project backlog could push annual savings to $1 billion. Other areas I highlighted included eliminating the Maritime Administration, the Coast Guard Bridge Program, and reforming international food aid. I would also add the regional development authorities. While not part of the regular discretionary spending, federal disaster spending should be considered. The number and cost of disasters are increasing, and the federal share of those costs have also dramatically increased, from rising from less than 30% after Hurricane Hugo in 1989 to more than 75% after Superstorm Sandy in 2012. Between 1980 and 1999, we averaged $4 billion disasters. Since then, 7. The median disaster cost between 2000 and 2006, $6.2 billion. 2007 to 2013, $9.1 billion. The nation's disaster programs need to be reformed to provide incentives for communities and states to plan for the inevitable disasters and ensure every dime spent pre-spawns to the next inevitable disaster. We also know that every dollar spent on mitigation saves 4 in recovery. We should be helping people, communities, and states prepare for disaster and respond in a way that protects taxpayers by reducing future risks and costs. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you. As I said at the beginning, Taxpayers for Common Sense is ready to work with you to root out waste and ensure our precious tax dollars are being spent wisely and effectively. effectively. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have in the testimony or any other area of discretionary spending.
Thank you. We're going to next move to Mr. Thomas Schatz, who is president of the Citizens Against Government Waste. Mr. Schatz represents an organization wholly focused on working to root out and eliminate government waste. Mr. Schatz himself has played a big part in those efforts. In almost 3 decades, he's been working with CAGW. Mr. Schatz has a law degree from George Washington and a bachelor's degree from the State University of New York at Binghamton. Mr. Schatz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Baldwin, Senators Ayotte and Ernst. Very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today, especially with my colleagues who have contributed a great deal to this effort, and we're always happy to work together with both you and them to achieve our mutual goals. I am Tom Schatz, president of Citizens Against Government Waste, an organization that was founded in 1984 by J. Peter Grace and Jack Anderson to follow up on the implementation of recommendations made by President Ronald Reagan's President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control, which is why it became known as the Grace Commission. It is no secret that wasteful spending is pervasive throughout the federal government, and every agency could perform its functions more effectively and efficiency. Recommendations to eliminate waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement are provided regularly by government agencies and the private sector. For example, since 1993, Citizens Against Government Waste has released Prime Cuts, the latest version of which identifies 601 recommendations that would save taxpayers $639 billion in 1 year and $2.6 trillion over 5 years. And to your point, as Chairman Paul, about making recommendations for wasteful spending, we send recommendations from Prime Cuts on a regular basis when appropriations bills are heading to the floor, suggesting amendments that could be considered by the House. We haven't done it for the Senate because I haven't really done appropriations, so we look forward to be able to do that this year. And while my written statement covers numerous systematic and legislative efforts to eliminate wasteful spending, today I'm going to focus on agriculture. Proponents of the 2014 Farm Bill claim that it reformed many programs, but that certainly was not true about the sugar program. Nothing was done whatsoever. This is an outdated and wasteful program that provides price supports, tariffs, quotas, loans, and domestic marketing allotments that have artificially inflated the price of sugar to about 40% higher than the world price, costing consumers about $3.5 billion annually between 2009 and 2012 for sugar-containing products, and thousands of jobs have been lost in industries that use sugar, particularly candy manufacturers. And sugar producers forfeited $152 million worth of sugar to the USDA in September and October 2013. In March 2015, CBO forecasts that the U.S. sugar program will cost taxpayers an additional $115 million over the next 10 years. And as my friend Steve Ellis has pointed out, in most cases, Farm Bill savings, quote unquote, have been vastly underestimated, and I think TCS said $450 billion for the 2004-2008 bills, so we know these numbers are not going to be achieved. And despite efforts in both the House and the Senate, and even in President Obama's budget, to eliminate or reduce spending for the Market Access Program, this program survives. It is a poster child for corporate welfare. MAP has delivered advertising subsidies to companies such as Blue Diamond, Butterball, Dole, McDonald's, Pillsbury, Sunkist, Tyson, and Welch clearly can afford their own advertising overseas. One of the most absurd examples under MAP was the $20 million provided to the Cotton Council International in 2011, some of which was used to create an Indian reality TV show in which designers created clothing made from cotton in order to promote the general use of cotton, but not necessarily cotton from the U.S. And remember, this is U.S. taxpayer dollars. In fact, India produces twice the amount of U.S. cotton growers and is a net exporter. Perhaps the most outrageous waste of money under MAP was in the early 90s, $3 million provided to the California Raisin Board to air in Japan those well-known ads featuring dancing raisins singing "I Heard It Through the Grapevine." Couldn't be translated into Japanese, so it ran in English and was therefore incomprehensible. Children thought the fingers were potatoes or chocolate, and there was something about cutting off fingers, some criminal syndicates in Japan. In any event, it ended up costing $2 for every dollar's worth of raisins that even reached the store shelves, let alone some. So if those two examples are not embarrassing enough to really get rid of MAP, maybe there'll be more, but it's something that really should be terminated. Taxpayers shouldn't be doing any of this. It costs $200 million a year. Eliminating it would save $1 billion over 5 years. Another area we have looked at is stimulus, broadband grants and loans to the Rural Utility Service, $2.5 billion to RUS. March 2013 USDA Inspector General report noted that numerous projects overbilled next to existing private sector competitors and providers, and they approved 10 projects worth more than $91 billion that couldn't even be completed within the 3-year time frame. Steve mentioned the regional authorities, in particular the Delta Regional Authority established in 2000. It's supposed to improve conditions in the economy for 10 million people residing in 252 counties and parishes in 10 Mississippi Delta states, duplicates other programs, and really shouldn't be funded. It's had earmarks worth $17.8 million and something else that should be done. But in terms of what Congress should do, better stewardship of the taxpayers' money should be what every member of the House and Senate considers every day. Thinking first and foremost how to better manage the taxpayers' money and solve problems effectively with the resources that are already allocated, rather than doing what unfortunately members of both parties have done, which is to create a new program to solve a problem. Let's determine how to solve the problem first, look at what's out there. With $4 trillion, there has to be enough money to do what needs to be done. And thank you, appreciate it, and happy to work with the committee on additional recommendations.
Thank you. Before we get to Dr. Kettle, Senator Ayotte has another committee hearing, and I'm going to recognize her.
Thank you so much, Chairman Paul, and appreciate this hearing. And I just want to thank all of you for the work that you do. It's obviously very important. And I just had a follow-up. I know that the chair and ranking member are going to be gathering legislative proposals, so I think that's a great way to approach this and figure out what we could send from this committee that's more direct and specific. And Mr. Schatz, I noticed in your testimony that you said Congress would be well served to act on its own watchdogs' voluminous reports. I agree with you because GAO's done a lot of work on this. And so I have a bill, the Duplication Elimination Act, that perhaps we could take up, but basically it forces expedited action on those recommendations instead of having them sit on the shelf to make the president bring forward a proposal, whether within a certain time as to once the GAO issues the duplication report, as to which recommendations he or she will adopt or not, and then has us vote yes or no on them. And I think that would be good to at least get us acting on the work that's already been done. So I hope we can take that up. But I wanted to just touch briefly on the tax side of it, because one particular tax provision that's really bothered me is this the refundable tax provisions. One is the additional child tax credit, and there's been investigations done of that tax credit that have shown when you file as a taxpayer, you don't have to put a Social Security number for even the child. First of all, the filer doesn't, but the child, to identify that the child that you're seeking the refund on, you don't have to. And what we've learned is just by requiring a Social Security number for the child just to seek that refund, you'd save $20 billion over 10 years. So there's real money there. And what other thoughts do you have in terms of, I agree with you on the government spending side, there's a lot of work we should do, and you've identified a whole host of areas, and GAO has as well. What thoughts do you have on the tax expenditure side, as using the ACTC as one example that I've certainly been trying to make us change that, but other low-hanging fruit, and I think there's a lot of it that we could look on both sides of this equation.
We certainly, in the common sense cuts, we include a lot of tax expenditures in there that could be eliminated. Certainly in the biofuels realm, there were a lot of tax expenditures that are included in there as well. And then we have looked at reforming even some of the scary ones to make sure that they actually perform better, even to going to something like the mortgage interest deduction and making it so that it's more useful to more people, but also less costly. It's following on a recommendation from the CBO, actually. And so I think that's a very ripe opportunity, and we'd certainly be willing to work with you and identify. And like I said, there are many tax expenditures in our report that we'd like to introduce into the record.
Great. Yes.
Senator, if I might, to put this in a broader context to underline how important the question is, we're now at the point where tax expenditures are as large as the discretionary spending in the entire federal budget. That's a staggering fact, but it turns out to be true. Tax expenditures are as large as discretionary spending. We pay fairly careful attention to discretionary spending. We pay very little attention to the question of how tax expenditures work, who benefits from them, whether there are better ways of being able to do it, and whether or not we might be able to even apply the lessons from the book you co-authored, Moneyball, which, by the way, my students have it required reading in the fall to make sure that they get the message on this, that we need to find ways of being able to provide better analytical support for the kind of decisions.
Well,
we're
actually
making.
measuring whether something works. Shocking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just trying to combine the Moneyball approach with the tax expenditure piece. What if we we know we don't pay nearly enough attention to discretionary spending, but we pay almost no attention to tax expenditures. And if we used that Moneyball approach to understand what we're getting for the money that we're spending and apply that to the tax expenditure side, that in itself would be an enormous breakthrough.
Thank you.
But, Senator, it seems to me one of the ways to address tax expenditures is to simplify the tax code.
Amen. I agree. Yeah. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm going to take the privilege of introducing Dr. Don Kettle for his testimony. So I'm glad you've had a great opportunity to speak to some of the questions already. I want to add my personal thanks for being here. Dr. Kettle is a professor of public administration at the University of Maryland and has been associated with many fine academic institutions, but I remember getting to know Dr. Kettle back in 1992 when he was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And while I was beginning my career in public service when I was first elected to the State Assembly, Dr. Kettle led several very important efforts in Wisconsin. He was chaired the commission that was the Governor's Blue Ribbon Commission on Campaign Finance Reform, and later the Wisconsin Governor's Blue Ribbon Commission on State and Local Partnerships for the 21st Century. That later became known statewide as the Kettle Commission. We still refer to it. And I'm tremendously pleased, Dr. Kettle, that you're joining us today to provide us with your insight on to how we can address the issues of wasteful spending. Dr. Kettle comes at it from a perspective of someone who's worked in public management and in budgeting for almost his entire adult life. So thank you for being here, and we await your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, it's a great privilege for me to be here today. And while I'm no longer living in Wisconsin, I still am a member and a proud shareholder of the Green Bay Packers as well. So I have my roots still firmly rooted back in Wisconsin as well. And as I've mentioned earlier today, the foremost and most important question that we have to try to focus on is simply this: how can we best deliver value to taxpayers? And that's the question that we need to get up every morning, be prepared to look at, ask, and to be able to answer. And to be able to get at the question of government waste, there's nothing that's more important than trying to get a handle on that. And I want to suggest two ways. The first is trying to understand what it is that government ought to do and whether or not government ought to be doing it at all. And there's where the movement that Senator Ayotte has been so influential in, and Moneyball, bringing better data analytics to governmental programs, is something that could provide a terribly, fundamentally important way to be able to resolve those questions. But I want to spend most of my time today looking at a second question, which is, once we decide that government needs to do something, how can we best deliver quality services? Because there's nothing ultimately more wasteful to the public than for the government to commit to doing something and then not to do it well. And so what I want to do is to try to examine the question about how best to try to do those things that we all agree that government must do. There's Medicare and Medicaid, and while we can think about reformulating it, we're not likely to walk away from that. There's food safety, which is increasingly not just a domestic issue, but a global issue. One of the assignments I give my students is to go to the canned goods aisles and read the labels and find out where the food that they're eating actually comes from. We have critical infrastructure, airport security, and a whole host of other things that we all agree that one way or another must be done and must be done well. And there's nothing that's more fundamentally wasteful, and there's nothing that's fundamentally more damaging to the social contract between government and its citizens than the failure to deliver. So I want to try to examine that question and try to figure out how we can get to the bottom of things. I want to try to focus on four basic issues, which begin first with the GAO high-risk list. And I think that one of the things that we can admit is that the list is far too long and it costs far too much money. But most importantly, a careful look at it, and this is very important for the committee's work, we can identify those things at which we can do to help agencies get off the list. There are root causes that lie at the core of the problems in that high-risk list. They include, first, the boundary management question. It's important to recognize that, for example, in terms of food safety is a close partnership between government's inspectors on the one hand and government's food producers, its packagers, its resellers, all along the line. And food safety is only as good as that chain is. And so in this, as in so many other cases, government's effectiveness depends on being able to manage those boundaries. The second is performance metrics. They're not only is the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act, but we've seen already in this hearing today, through both the Bush and the Obama administrations, that substantial progress has been made in trying to improve performance metrics in government, and more work on that front would have enormous payoffs. There are information systems. A key part of the problem of delivering quality services to veterans is to get the information systems in the Pentagon, which document injuries that members of the armed services have been exposed to talk to the data systems that are in the VA. That turns out to be an extraordinarily difficult problem, and we will never serve the veterans well until we solve the problem of integrating those information systems. This technology management, which gets down to the $22 billion effort to develop the next generation of air traffic control system, and then human capital, which is fundamentally important to everything. If you look at the issues of human capital and talent management that run through GAO's high-risk list, not only are 2/3 of the programs in GAO's analysis directly attributable to problems in human capital management, but at the end, every single issue to be solved requires the right people with the right skills and the right place at the right time to ensure that what government must do gets done and gets done well. I mentioned one figure earlier, which is that $144 million of spending by the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services is counted for each individual employee, which is a staggering number. My other favorite statistic, maybe my single favorite statistic about the entire federal government, is that Medicare and Medicaid combined account for 20% of all federal spending, but 0.2% of all federal employees. So we can debate separately about how many federal employees we need, but I think we have to recognize the fact that that's a place where we need good federal employees, because otherwise what we must do won't get done. But the most important thing is that we know that if we solve these problems, and this is my second major point, we can save substantial amounts of money. My own guess is that something like $150 billion a year of spending of savings could be achieved by simply tackling and solving the problems in the high-risk list. At least $150 billion a year, of which $125 billion simply are coming through the improper payments. Third thing is that, and this is maybe the most reassuring piece, these problems are solvable. In the course of the last 25 years or so, GAO has actually removed 23 programs from the high-risk list, as Senator Baldwin pointed out earlier. There are those who refer to it as the Hotel California. Once you check in, you can't check out. But it turns out that, in fact, agencies have been able, with strong leadership and effective management, to be able to get off the high-risk list, and by doing so, save taxpayers money, and that is a good thing. It requires strong leadership, strong backup, and the ability to be able to put into practice the analysis of the root causes that we've talked about, but that can save substantial amounts of money. And the last thing is to reduce wasteful duplication and overlap. It's clear that we have way too much of this, that going back and asking how we can better do the things that could be done, including, for example, simply coordinating the transport of patients to government and private medical facilities, could have an enormous impact. And the Partnership for Public Service has found that shared public services could also go a long way toward trying to accomplish some of the same objectives. If we can find ways of achieving better coordination, we can save a substantial amount of money. But most importantly, it gets down to, first, understanding what it is that government should and shouldn't do, and having a serious conversation with ourselves about that. But second, once we commit as a government to doing things on behalf of citizens, nothing is more fundamentally important than doing that well. There's nothing more wasteful of governmental money. There's nothing more destructive of trust of citizens in their government than having government programs in which the government doesn't deliver. I very much appreciate the chance to appear before you today and be happy to try to explore any questions that might be of use to the subcommittee.
Great. I want to ask you to drill down a little bit more deeply in some of the issues that you outlined. And in particular, let's start with information technology. As I hear the 30,000-foot discussion among my colleagues, there is a sort of tension between the increasing need for interoperability, the ability for agencies to communicate, share data, share information to be most efficient. And against that, we see news of cyber attacks that have created access to hackers to millions of people's identifiable information. Do you think a more interconnected network increases vulnerabilities in this regard compared with lots of smaller systems? Or do you think it's possible that we can improve the capacity and the sharing and the coordination, as you outline, and protect privacy as well as protect from identity theft, et cetera?
Yeah. That's an important question, Senator, and it's worth underlining the fact that this is not just a public sector problem. If we go back and look at what happened to Sony, you could have taken everything that you just said and scratch off the government, insert Sony, and be making exactly the same points. This is a larger society-wide question that we all are trying to deal with right now. On the one hand, having more data systems that are interconnected is simply an inevitability. It's not something we can avoid. It's not really a policy choice any longer if we're going to have any kind of connection whatsoever to quality of services. We just can't imagine being able to make payments in Medicare without having an interconnection of information between patients, providers, financial intermediaries, and Medicare and Medicaid, state governments, the federal government, and those who are responsible for dealing with all that. There's just no way to be able to deal with it. The question of centralization then becomes the important question, and the technological reality is that the more dispersed the information systems are, in some ways the more potentially vulnerable the entire system is, because all it takes is one individual, one 16-year-old in some basement somewhere, burrowing into some system anywhere, getting access to that and being able then through the network to be able to get access to everything. And in fact, there are lots of 16-year-olds and lots of very sophisticated government employees working for other governments trying to do exactly that at this very moment. The VA right now gets 1 billion probes a month into its information systems. So the question is, how best can we protect ourselves? The more we distribute the information, on the one hand, it may seem like we're protecting it, but we're actually increasing vulnerability because we're increasing the points of penetration. The best way to try to protect is to at least make sure that we have central coordination of those efforts to try to protect and provide security. And it's one of the things that we've found through the data breaches that have occurred most recently. The greatest points of vulnerability have come through the systems that are most distributed. So this is not an argument, and it raises important concerns about privacy and about government's power, and it's the kind of thing that really is increasingly a fundamental puzzle and problem. But the basic technological facts are the more distributed we make the system, the more points of vulnerability we create.
Do you want to go back and forth, or?
Go ahead, because I think I'll just finish up when you're done.
Okay. I'd also like you to, and by the way, if there's others who would like to focus on the information technology piece of this, please, if you have a comment to add, Mr. Edwards, please go ahead.
On the technology issue, I agree with a lot of what Don says, but I don't agree with one of his comments that, we can always improve the management and make government work better. The federal government, the civilian outside of the Pentagon in particular, has always had a problem with technology. It's never done technology very well. He mentioned the FAA, air traffic control. It's having a giant problem currently with a big next-gen project. I've looked in history. You go back decades. The GAO has done reports in the 90s and the 80s. The FAA has always had problems implementing new technology. And, air traffic control, it's a high-tech business. I don't think the government does high-tech very well. And, so here's an example where I think this is something that should be moved outside of government. We have examples now in Britain and Canada. They have privatized their air traffic control over a decade ago, and it has worked extremely well. We no longer have the best air traffic control system in the world. The experts are generally pointing to Canada, which has a standalone nonprofit, and some of the advantages they have by having this standalone system, they can hire the best tech experts, they can pay them flexibly, they can make decisions quickly, they can innovate and create new technology. And the Canadians now with air traffic control, They're creating new ATC technology, then they're exporting it to the world. We can't do that with our system because it's government, it's got civil service rules. So I think when industries and activities of the government get very technologically advanced, we ought to think about moving them outside of government.
Let me follow up with perhaps both of you on this. I want to get to the intersection of Dr. Kettle, your comments about needing the right people at the right time in the right place, this management of human capital and talent to address the, whether it's the GAO high-risk list or other issues, and also this idea that we should be learning from those efforts that have removed agencies or enterprises from the GAO high-risk list. What are the lessons to be learned that can be exported to other entities or within an entity that has seen repeated problems, one right after the other? There's an intersection of those two issues, and I don't know if you could explore that further for us, Dr. Kettle, and then take any response.
Sure, and let me just use one example. I had a long conversation not too long ago about two kinds of things in a session that we organized at the National Academy of Public Administration. And it was looking at the high-risk list not as a spotlight on government mismanagement, but a spotlight on government learning. Because it turns out that if you look carefully at it, there are important things that one can learn if you look at the overall systems and tease out of that those things that actually work. There are lots of things that government surely doesn't do right, but the fact that almost 24 programs have been removed from the high-risk list for doing things well is evidence that those things that we expect government to do actually can be done better if certain things are done effectively. And one important point is fascinating to watch the story of the census over the last couple times. They've been on the high-risk list twice have been removed. They're now gearing up for the next round of the census in 2020. So we can debate lots of things, but unless we amend the Constitution, the one thing that government has to do is to conduct a census because the other body needs it for apportioning seats. And so the Constitution requires that. They have already started the process of figuring out how to manage the technology to be able to make that happen. They had technological problems the last time around that they've worked to study and learn from. They are doing alpha testing and beta testing of the new technological systems. My guess is that they will do the next round very well. And here's an example of technology in government that is likely to work pretty effectively. And there are other things government clearly is not struggling as well with. What's the difference? And the answer is they're looking at this as a strategic problem. They're getting high-level leadership to focus on it. They're getting highly skilled people to work on it. They are interacting with citizens right now to figure out how to deal with the testing of it. They're working with other countries as well to export and to share some of the learning processes that are possible so that it is a possible problem to solve. The government often tends to do very hard things, often tends to do things with not enough in the way of resources under very high levels of expectation. There are lots of cases where in the private sector problems are buried in dumpsters out back that end up in the front page of newspapers just because the process is different. It's not to be apologetic, but to recognize the fact when you try to do hard things, you're going to make mistakes. The way to learn is to learn from those mistakes and to build those in. And there's no better example of that in government, especially in technology, than to watch what's now happening with census. Here, 2020 we're talking about. They are hip deep already in the process of beta testing the technology they're going to be rolling out.
I want to thank the panel for coming today, and I wanted to sort of conclude by, we'll see if anybody has any final remarks to make, but I think there are ways we can look at government waste that could be process reforms, there could be program elimination, or there could be program modification. With the process reforms, I think there are a lot of good ideas. One of the ideas that we put forward and we're trying to get a vote on this week on NDAA is to give civilians bonuses based on finding savings. Spending apparently speeds up to about 5 times faster than normal in the last month. A lot of conventions seem to be in Las Vegas in the last month of the fiscal year. I would love to give somebody who's in charge of $12 million who saves the taxpayer $1 million, I'd love to give them $10,000. and put it back into the Treasury. Give them a $10,000 bonus and put the money back in the Treasury. If you ask any American in the country, should we do this? It's overwhelming. It's probably a 99% issue. But up here it's difficult because people are like, oh, no, we've appropriated it. We got to spend it. But this is something that has a great deal of popular support. That would be a process reform. We have the same for Department of Defense contractors. If you got a $1 billion contract and you'll save $100 million, give them a little more profit to save the taxpayer. Give them a percentage of the savings they can find. This is after it's already been competitively bid. If they will come in under, we're going the opposite way. We're always going over bid. If you'll come under bid, give them more profit. Build incentives into a system that isn't a marketplace and doesn't have all the incentives that make capitalism work efficiently. I don't think any committee's tried to do this before, but I'd really like is a continuing process to see if you will give us a list of things that can be process reforms, program elimination, or program reforms. Now, we may not get everybody to agree to a lot of program elimination, so bear that in mind. But let's say we had 100 ideas from all of you, from us, from the minority, and we all went through all of us, and we checked off, and we agreed on 20. We could have a consensus report of being for 20 reforms. I don't know if it's possible or not, but I think it's worth a try. Nothing else seems to have worked around here since Senator Proxmire left. And we'll see. But bear in mind, I don't mind if we get ideas for eliminating things that we may not agree on. Let's just see. Maybe there are some programs we'd agree on eliminating. Maybe there'd be some reforms. Like, I don't think there's going to be a consensus or anybody saying let's get rid of the school lunch program. But would there be a way to better police it so we're not giving it to everybody, where we're giving it to those in need? I think that's true of so many of our things. And people go crazy anytime you want to talk about disability. But the thing is healthy people shouldn't get disability, you know? And someone who has quadriplegia or paraplegia and can't take care of themselves, we've got enough money for stuff like that, but we don't have enough money for everybody who is currently on disability, and I think there are some problems where we can make it better. All kinds of things throughout government, but we never try to get to consensus. My hope is that we will try, and you'll continue to help us with lists on this. My staff will communicate with you and your staff. You all are part of bigger organizations that can help. If you will continue to work with us, we'll see what kind of list we can come up with. And then if Senator Baldwin will work with us, we'll see if we can get any kind of consensus. Does anybody have any kind of remark they'd like to make as we close?
If I wouldn't mind, Romina brought up corporate welfare. When John Kasich was a member of Congress, he brought together people from the left and the right. I remember sitting in a room with Ralph Nader and many others talking about corporate welfare, something that neither side really likes, but yet it always seems difficult to eliminate. Market access program being a prime example. That might be a place to start. And you may draw in some other members that may look at this in a different way. And then in terms of process, well, just in terms of doing things, Senator Ayotte has a good idea about the GAO reports. There also should be a rule for Senate committees that while you probably can't stop them from creating a new program, perhaps the existing programs for that particular area can be listed in the committee reports. That's now true in the House. Senator Langford, when he was a member of Congress, helped lead the House rules to be amended to require the committees to include that information. So there should be more transparency about whether a program duplicates another program. And that's at least a place to start. Maybe there's a good argument to have another program, but usually there isn't.
And Senator, one thing I would add, and Mr. Chairman, I think is terribly important, is the potential role that this committee can play in ensuring continuity of action on some of these things that we think really could be effective. By putting this list together, it's an agenda not just for legislative action in the relatively near term, but as we debate the ongoing management and decision-making about policy decisions in this country, we can set some markers down that could help shape the debate as we go forward. And the committee would be playing an enormous public service in doing that, if nothing else.
I agree with Dr. Kettle that there are many ways that government could operate better, but I think one of the challenges that we face is that government is trying to do too much, and so it's not doing very many things well. There's lots of low-hanging fruit, programs that if we could finally eliminate, the Congress could focus its oversight efforts on those things that the government must do and then could do those things better. We should be more selective about what the government should do, and I think budget process matters there. We're currently having a debate whether to increase discretionary spending. There's a cap on it. I think we should leverage this as an opportunity to prioritize within the budget, and we also should be careful not to shift spending from the discretionary budget to the mandatory side of the budget. There's a bill right now in the House, the Cures bill, that proposes to do exactly that. We shouldn't be looking for ways to get around spending caps. We should be good stewards of taxpayer dollars and prioritize better within those dollars that are available.
One thing that I wish Congress would do more of, and Washington in general, frankly, is look at some of the good government reform ideas that have been implemented abroad that we could do in the United States as well. Big changes are risky, but I think when we have other high-income advanced countries making major reforms and they work, we should look at that and learn from it. I mentioned air traffic control, but there's also the post office, which you mentioned, Chairman Paul. Germany, the Netherlands have privatized their post offices, and Cameron privatized the 500-year-old Royal Mail last year. These have been successful reforms. California is having a big water drought the last few years. Some countries have gone to privatized water markets. Farm subsidies have come up at the hearing today. New Zealand completely abolished all their farm subsidies a couple decades ago. The farmers initially resisted, but after a while they realized they could actually do a lot better in free markets than with the subsidies. So there are good ideas out there. Often we can get them from our trading partners abroad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wrapping up a few things that have come up in the hearing I'm thinking about, and we started out talking about EXIM, the Export-Import Bank, and we talked about duplication. And so you have trade assistance programs at Commerce, the Small Business Administration, USDA, and the U.S. Trade Representative. So, I mean, we talked about duplication, and that's certainly one area where we should figure out what works, what doesn't, and consolidate and come up with a solution there. Certainly, Mr. Chairman, we support your bonus for cost cutters legislation, and we'll be interested to see about Senator Ayotte and Senator Ernst's legislation as well. And Senator Ernst talked about the projects way behind schedule and way over budget, and I have some classmates from the Coast Guard Academy that are over at St. Elizabeth's, where the DHS is going to go, because the Coast Guard headquarters has already moved there. You know, one of the programs I talked about in the program, the MOX, the mixed oxide fuels, that program was supposed to be, the project was supposed to be done in 2013. The estimated date has been pushed back to 2033. So there's issues there. And then also we talked about IT and communications, and I think about some of the issues we've seen, like for instance in farm payments, there are means testing rules there, and part of the limitation and why there have been overpayments to certain farmers is because they can't communicate and get the information from the IRS. The same thing happened with Medicare and some of the overpayments as well. And so, you know, we're really excited about this opportunity to really raise a lot of these programs, the process and the program elimination. And it started, one of the questions was about how do you actually tackle these? And we think that this type of hearing is exactly the right thing, to bring up specific ideas, to talk about them, to talk about the underlying problems and what we're trying to solve with these government programs, and then we either improve them or we decide that it shouldn't be something that we do at all. And so we're very excited about it. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. The record is open for 2 weeks. If anybody wants to add to it, those who have requested that their written remarks be made part of the record, we will. Thank you very much for your testimony.